In ancient Sumer, there was a word, Nam-lu-ulu. It meant humanity. But there was another word, Nam-en, that meant priesthood. The gap between these two terms wasn't linguistic. It was a chasm of power that defined civilization itself. For 3,000 years, across every major culture from the Nile to the Tigris, knowledge was not shared, it was sequestered, guarded, controlled by a class of intermediaries who stood between humanity and the gods. But why? What were they really protecting? The answer isn't what you think. Let's start with something simple. In ancient Egypt, the word for priest was hem-neter, servant of the god. But servant is a mistranslation. A more accurate rendering would be keeper, because what priests kept wasn't just ritual, it was information. Consider this. In the Old Kingdom, less than 1% of the population could read. And who controlled that 1%? The temples. The scribal schools were temple institutions. To become literate meant entering the priesthood or serving it directly. Knowledge wasn't democratized, it was institutionalized. This wasn't unique to Egypt. In Mesopotamia, the Umanu, the scholar priests of Babylon, controlled access to cuneiform literacy. In Mesoamerica, Maya priests alone could interpret the glyphs. In ancient Israel, the Levitical priesthood held exclusive rights to read and teach the Torah. Across continents, across millennia, the pattern repeats. Why did every ancient civilization hand literacy to the same class of people? Because literacy was never neutral. It was a weapon. In a world without printing presses, without public libraries, without schools, the ability to record and retrieve information gave you control over memory itself. Laws could be rewritten, histories could be erased, treaties could be forged, and no one outside the scribal class would ever know. The Hittite Empire kept its diplomatic correspondence in Akkadian, a language only trained scribes could read. Egyptian temple archives were written in hieratic, a cursive script even more restricted than hieroglyphs. The effect was the same, information bottlenecked through a literate elite. But it wasn't just about record-keeping. Literacy enabled prediction. And in the ancient world, prediction was indistinguishable from prophecy. What happens when you can predict the future and no one else can? You become a god. Ancient priesthoods didn't just observe the heavens, they monopolized them. In Babylon, the Tupshar-Enuma and Lil, the scribes of celestial omens, recorded planetary movements for centuries. They knew Venus cycled every 8 years. They knew lunar eclipses followed an 18-year pattern called the Saros cycle. And they told no one. Why? Because the calendar was powerful. It determined when to plant, when to harvest, when to wage war, when to crown kings. In agrarian societies, getting the calendar wrong meant famine. Getting it right meant divine favor. The Maya long count calendar required astronomical knowledge so precise that it tracked cycles spanning thousands of years. Only the Akin, the daykeepers, possessed it. Pharaohs in Egypt couldn't perform the Sed festival without priests calculating the heliacal rising of Sirius. Even Julius Caesar needed the Egyptian priest Sisigines to reform the Roman calendar. Control the calendar, control time itself. But what if knowledge of the stars wasn't the real secret? Here's where it gets strange. Many priesthoods didn't just restrict knowledge, they obscured it. They created layers, outer teachings for the public, inner teachings for initiates, and at the core, something else entirely. In ancient Egypt, the pyramid texts were carved inside royal tombs where no living person would see them. The instructions for navigating the afterlife were hidden in the dark. Why write them at all? Unless the texts themselves weren't the point. unless access was. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece promised initiates knowledge of death and rebirth. For 1,000 years, people traveled to Eleusis, and for 1,000 years, not one initiate revealed what they learned. The penalty for disclosure was death. But here's the question. Was the secret a teaching, or was the secret that there was no teaching, only belonging? Because initiation doesn't just give you knowledge, it gives you legitimacy. It makes you kin to the gods. And once you've claimed that kinship, what are you really protecting? Not truth, authority. Priesthoods didn't guard knowledge because it was dangerous. They guarded it because access was dangerous. The moment everyone could read the laws, interpret the stars, perform the rituals, the priesthood became unnecessary. So they built walls, not of stone, but of language, sacred scripts, initiatory rites, astronomical complexities. They made knowledge expensive, time-consuming, dangerous to pursue outside approved channels, and they wrapped it in the language of the divine. The genius wasn't the knowledge itself. The genius was convincing entire civilizations that only certain people could handle it. And when those walls finally fell, when the printing press arrived, when vernacular Bibles spread, when public education emerged, priesthoods lost their monopoly, not because the knowledge changed, but because the gatekeepers became obsolete. But one question remains. If priesthoods across every major civilization used the same methods, restricted literacy, controlled calendars, sacred languages, initiatory hierarchies, were they protecting knowledge or were they protecting themselves? Because in the temples of Egypt, in the ziggurats of Babylon, in the codices of the Maya, there are texts we still can't fully read. Not because the languages are lost, but because the contexts are, the rituals, the initiations, the reasons they were written. For centuries, this knowledge remained locked behind temple walls, not because humanity couldn't understand it, but because it didn't need to. When the future is predictable, obedience becomes reasonable. And when prediction is mistaken for divine insight, power no longer needs force. In ancient Sumer, they understood this early. Humanity wasn't defined by what it knew, but by what it was allowed to know. That's why there was another word, not for people, but for those who decided.